So, hello everybody.
Ja, hallo alle zusammen. Es ist total toll, hier mal wieder in Person zu sein, nach diesen vielen Jahren, in denen wir auseinandergehalten wurden. Und deswegen bin ich wirklich geehrt, euch alle hier heute zu sehen.
My name is Crawford, and I'm going to tell you a very different story about artificial intelligence today. In my new book, Atlas of AI, I argue that the tech sector has become the new extractive industry of the 21st century. But to show you why this is true, we need to visit some of the places where AI is made, and I mean that in the fullest sense. We need to map the political ecology of AI as a planetary infrastructure. So, let's start with a deceptively simple question. What is artificial intelligence? Well, if you type AI into Google image search, this is what you get. You'll get rows of blue numbers, men in glasses staring into the middle distance, and lots of white robots. And of course, they're almost always white. So I would like to suggest that this is a very problematic and actually misleading framing of AI. But it's very common. We're told that AI is abstract, ethereal, immaterial. It's just neutral algorithms in a cloud. But to find out what AI is really made of, we need to take a more material, grounded, and global perspective. So in order to write Atlas of AI, I wanted to leave the abstract nowheres of algorithms to visit the specific somewheres where production happens. From the mining sites in rare earth mineral locations where they're being pulled from the ground, to the labs where the massive data sets are being harvested from the internet, to the factories where humans do rote tasks to make AI seem intelligent. So this is why I use the concept of an atlas. An atlas is obviously a very unusual type of book. It allows you to zoom out and zoom in. You can see a whole continent or just a city. And I think we need these scalar shifts to truly understand something as vast as contemporary computation. But atlases, of course, are also accounts of domination by colonial powers where territory is carved along the fault lines of power. So by invoking an atlas, I'm suggesting that we need deeper ways to understand the empires of AI and what lies beneath these very distracting spectacles of the latest machine learning models. So a major inspiration for writing this book was this project that I did with Vladan Jola from Novi Sad. It's called Anatomy of an AI System. And this is where we made a giant map of everything that it takes to make a single Amazon Echo work, you know, those little cylinders that are listening to you. So we looked at the minerals, we looked at data processing, we traced the device disposal in the ground. Now, that project was a much bigger research endeavor than either of us expected it to be. It took 2 years. We had to study things like pay scales, supply chains, smelting practices, container shipping. It went on and on. But when we completed this project, I wanted to expand this analysis from a single AI device to look at the entire AI industry. So I structure Atlas of AI around 8 chapters. But in order to give you a very quick tour, I'm going to take a transverse cut through these topics to address 3 sites of extraction: human labor, earth, and space. Or, to put it another way, rocks, flesh, and rockets. So we're going to start by looking at the politics of rocks and brine, because AI is made of minerals and fossil fuels extracted from the deep time of the planet. At the flesh layer, we'll consider the politics of ligaments and sweat of human bodies, because AI is also made of human tissue. And finally, we'll follow the rockets at the frontier of the extractive practices, where we'll see how deep space is furthering the ideology of tech power. So let's turn to the first domain, the politics of rocks. This is one of the first field sites that I visited for the book. It is Silver Peak in the Clayton Valley in Nevada. Now, this is a mining town. It's one of the oldest, actually, in the state. And it was almost abandoned in 1917 after the ground was stripped bare of gold and silver during the mining boom. And it wasn't until the 1950s, when they scoped this area for strategic minerals during the Cold War, that they realized that Silver Peak is perched on the edge of a massive underground lake of lithium. So that very valuable lithium brine under the surface is being pumped out into these giant, iridescent green ponds to evaporate. It's in fact the only operating lithium mine in the US. And this makes Silver Peak a site of intense interest to tech tycoons like Elon Musk for one reason: rechargeable batteries. So here, in this remote pocket of Nevada, is a place where the stuff of AI is made. So lithium is also known as grey gold. Smartphone batteries, for example, have about 7 grams of this material. An Amazon Echo has about double that. But a Tesla Model S car needs about 62 kilograms of this stuff in order to make its battery pack. So these kinds of batteries were never intended to supply a machine as power-hungry as a car, but they are in fact the only mass-market option available. All of these batteries have a limited lifespan. They're very difficult to recycle, and they're generally thrown away as waste. But if you go 200 miles north of Silver Peak, you see this place. This is the Tesla Gigafactory. It's in fact the world's largest lithium battery plant, and Tesla is estimated to use basically around 28,000 tons of lithium hydroxide every year. That's about half of the planet's total consumption. A 2020 study by the University of Augsburg showed, and actually did some really good modeling, to try and figure out how long we'll be able to mine lithium, how much we effectively have left. On the most optimistic estimate, and assuming we learn how to recycle better, lithium looks to be fully depleted a few years after 2100. But without best practices, we could see shortages as soon as 2040. So we're just starting to see an intimation of what this might feel like at the moment with the semiconductor crisis. Which brings me to this location. This is the Indonesian islands of Bangka and Belitung. These two islands together produce about 90% of Indonesia's tin, and they supply companies like Samsung, Sony, LG, and Foxconn. And the landscapes of these islands reveal the high cost of semiconductor production. So on these islands, you'll see many informal miners who are on these makeshift pontoons, scraping the seabed and diving underwater to suck the tin out of the ground with these giant vacuum tubes. But tin mining is actually incredibly environmentally destructive. And of course, it's destroyed forests, farms, fish stocks, and the coral reefs. And where the ground isn't covered with mines, it's actually pockmarked with the graves of the miners who have died digging to meet the demand for tin. And we know why that demand is so high. On average, a 21st century person uses around 10 times more minerals than a person from the 20th century. And of course, it's our AI devices that are a big driver for this demand. In a single iPhone, there are 75 elements. That's around 2/3 of the periodic table. So from the perspective of deep time, we are extracting Earth's geological history to serve a split second of technological convenience. And this is all used to build objects like Android phones, Apple Watches, and Amazon Echoes that have an average lifespan of 4.7 years before they end up being discarded. And all of those AI devices end up in places like this, buried in e-waste dumping grounds. They're commonly located in places like Thailand, Ghana, and Pakistan. And this is why I think we need to look much further than Europe and the United States to see the legacies of the tech industry. We need to turn to Bolivia, the site of the richest reserves of lithium, and because of that, ongoing political conflict. We need to look at central Congo, at China, Indonesia, and the Australian deserts. Although we rarely think of them as such, these are the true birthplaces of AI, but they're also the graveyards. And while minerals are the backbone of AI, of course, its lifeblood is still electrical energy. The processing demands and, of course, energy requirements of the latest large language and large image models is truly vast. One of the early papers looking at this issue came from Emma Struble at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and she found that running just one natural language processing model in a lab produced more than 660,000 pounds of carbon dioxide emissions. That's about 125 round trips between New York and Beijing. So while AI is an extractive industry of the 21st century, it is built upon the old extractive industries. And just like traditional forms of mining, the data economy is premised on maintaining a state of ignorance about its true planetary costs. The philosophers Hart and Negri have this excellent phrase. They talk about the dual operation of abstraction and extraction in information capitalism. The way in which the material conductions of how things are built are abstracted away to keep the process of information and resource extraction going. And I think this is actually a really helpful way to think about all of those abstract descriptions of AI, all of those clean white robots that we were looking at earlier. It's distracting us from the energy, labor, and data resources that are needed to keep the machine grinding on. So when we track the full materiality of AI, we can see that it is neither artificial nor intelligent. Rather, AI uses vast amounts of natural resources, labor, and energy. It's in fact a giant infrastructure project, and it's essentially spanning the planet. So far, I've focused on how it's not artificial, but let's now look at what's behind the claims of its intelligence. This is the fleshy layer of AI. And the story goes that AI systems are autonomously intelligent. But in fact, these systems require constant propping up by bodies all along the supply chain. So this is a typical picture that we tend to think of when we hear about the labor behind AI. But as we know, human labor goes a lot deeper than this layer, far beyond the highly paid engineers of Silicon Valley. Many low-paid workers are distributed around the world, helping to maintain this impression of AI magic, from miners to click workers to factory pickers. So this is another one of the field sites that I visited. It's Amazon's vast fulfillment warehouse in New Jersey. And you can see there are thousands of products arrayed across millions of shelves. And every item in this space is actually determined algorithmically to see what the most efficient use of space is between popular products. And of course, all of these shelves are in fact suspended on Kiva robots. So they're all moving around. And effectively, the workers have to kind of move around the robots and at the same time meet what is called the rate. That's the algorithmic rate that determines the speed of how many items you should be picking and packing as a worker. It's extremely physically and psychologically stressful. I saw so many people when I visited this particular warehouse wearing support bandages on their arms and knees, and you can just see the strain of working underneath the pressure of the algorithmic rate. And the company knows this too. Jeff Bezos, actually, in his letter to the shareholders, described his vision of how Amazon is going to deal with these high level of injuries in their workplaces. His solution? A new algorithm. And this algorithm is going to track the muscle tendon groups that people are using as they work. So this is effectively surveillance into the deep tissue layer of the body and beyond. Because employers now observe, assess, and modulate all of the intimate parts of the work cycle and our bodily data, down to micro movements of ligaments and our facial expressions. These, of course, are areas that were previously off limits to them. In a recent US survey, 66% of Amazon warehouse workers said that they experience serious physical pain on the job, and 42% say that they experience pain long after they've left work. And the worst sites are things like feet, knees, and lower backs. We could think of these as the musculoskeletal hotspots in a system that's optimized for algorithmic efficiency over human sustainability. So when Vladan Jola and I were researching Amazon's labor practices, we looked at some of the recent patents that had been filed by Amazon, and that's when we found this little-known patent. It depicts a metal cage that's intended for workers, and it gets moved around through the warehouse on the same robot system that's moving the shelves. But after we published this research and it got covered in the press, Amazon actually did something it rarely does. It issued a statement to say that it never intended to build this cage. But fortunately for us, the artist Simon Denny built a physical model of what the worker cage would look like, and so you can see that here. To me, this is actually a very powerful symbol of the profoundly asymmetric power relationship between low-paid labor and the tech sector. And of course, patents aren't necessarily meant to be built. Rather, I think of them as maps of the corporate imaginary, as a sort of a speculative capture of possible futures. Amazon has also patented this. These are augmented reality goggles that workers could wear inside the factory, and it will give them turn-by-turn directions, but at the same time, it's tracking walking speed, how long you stop or go to the bathroom for, and it also tracks your eye gaze at all times. This is literally seeing through the eyes of Amazon Corp. So, that's what labor looks like in the physical logistics layer. But what about the software layer? Well, there's a lot of underpaid work right now for people who will label data sets or test AI systems, or sometimes even pretend to be an AI system themselves. And this echoes a much earlier technology. Back in 1770, the Hungarian inventor Wolfgang von Klemperer invented this. This was a fantastic chess-playing robot called the Mechanical Turk. It could beat almost anyone, and it was the toast of Europe. But, of course, it was an elaborate illusion. There was a human chess master who was actually inside the box. And then if we fast forward a few centuries, Amazon creates a distributed labor platform of low-paid workers and calls it the same thing. Now it's Amazon's Mechanical Turk. But Jeff Bezos famously calls it artificial intelligence. But I prefer Astra Taylor's name for this, which is faux-automation, or fake automation. These shiny systems that seem to be intelligent, but are actually maintained by thousands of remote click workers in rural India, Malaysia, and China. In both von Klemperer's chess-playing robot of the 18th century and the 21st century's Amazon Mechanical Turk, The machine layer is hiding the work of so many humans underneath. Another fleshy site of extraction is our faces. So the latest expansion of facial recognition tools is mining our expressions to develop emotion recognition AI. Now, these systems are built on the assumption that you can determine somebody's inner state by analyzing their facial movements. These assumptions about emotions and people's faces I write about in the book, and I actually trace it back to this guy, Paul Ekman. He was a psychologist who started working in the 1960s, funded by the US Department of Defense. Ekman believed two things. First, that there are 6 emotions that are universal around the world: happiness, sadness, surprise, disgust, and fear. And the second thing he believed is that you could tell what somebody was feeling on the inside by simply looking at the micro-expressions in their face. So even if you're trying to hide your inner state, Ekman believed your face would betray you. Well, what was interesting is that Ekman's research, even from the earliest days in the 1960s, was getting an enormous amount of criticism from people like the anthropologist Margaret Mead, who observed that this idea erases all of the cultural difference and all of that messy relationality when we're feeling things and engaging with people. And most recently, the psychologist Lisa Feldman Barrett did the biggest wide-ranging survey of all of the papers about emotion recognition, and she showed that there was no consistent relationship between a facial expression and an internal state. So, a smile doesn't mean you're happy, and a frown doesn't mean you're mad. But of course, any of us who've ever worked in the service industry could have told you that. But as we will see, this hasn't stopped companies from implementing Ekman's ideas into production-level systems that are already being deployed in HR, policing, schools, and cars. For example, this is an AI system that watches you as you drive. If you're texting, or you look too far to the left or too far to the right, or you seem to be displaying emotions like anger or sadness, it will define you as distracted, and it will use that to increase your insurance premiums. One startup has even proposed using this kind of data and reporting you immediately to the police. The largest emotion tracking startup, Affectiva, was recently acquired by Smart Eye, a European company that does driver monitoring for major car manufacturers. The company plans to implement what they call interior sensing. That means surveilling all of the occupants inside a car for their emotional state. And I think there's an implicit vision here. It's an idea that there will be a world where sensors are effectively monitoring us constantly, analyzing our behavior and then our supposed emotional states, and then using that information to modulate our insurance or risk scores or even policing. I think we should think about this also as a type of enclosure. Back in the medieval period, farming was based in large fields that were commonly used and shared. But in the beginning of the 16th century, the Enclosure Acts of England abolished the open field system and radically upended the way people had farmed for centuries. And any right that villagers had over that land was gone. Over the periods of enclosure, about 1/5 of England, it's an enormous amount of land, was transferred from communal ownership into private property. So now in the 21st century, we're seeing a whole new kind of enclosure emerge. Muscle movements, facial expressions, autonomic body functions like your pulse rate or your sleep patterns, which were previously inaccessible to capital, have now become the new grounds for extraction and profit. So what's coming up next for all of these forms of enclosure and extraction? Well, just like they say, space is the final frontier, and that is now becoming the new mine for the tech sector. The ideology of the current space spectacle, I think, is deeply connected with the AI industry. All of the wealth and power that came from that sector is now being used by a small group of men to drive a private space race. There's this really striking promotional video that Jeff Bezos's company, Blue Origin, uses, and he actually gives away some of the thinking behind this company. He describes it as the most important work he's doing, and in his words, he says that the future is going to force us to make a choice. We have to decide if we want to have a civilization of stasis, that is, capping population and energy usage, or, in his words, we can fix the problem by moving into space. So I went out to a remote part of West Texas to see this. This is Blue Origin's suborbital rocket base. And out here in this remote desert, the company is building an extremely ambitious vision to bring about a future where millions of people are living and working in space. And specifically, Bezos has discussed building these huge space colonies where people will live in manufactured environments, all of the heavy industry will be moved off Earth, and then Earth will be zoned as a beautiful place to visit, presumably for the people who can afford it when they're not working in the off-world colonies. Now, if all of this sounds oddly familiar to you, it's because Jeff Bezos's inspiration comes in part from the science fiction novelist Gerard K. O'Neill. He wrote this book, The High Frontier, a wildly popular 1976 fantasy about space colonization. But the story behind O'Neill's fiction is actually really interesting. He wrote this book because he was driven to despair by a famous report that came out from the Club of Rome, which is called Limits to Growth. So this report published computer models in 1972 that argued that essentially resources and population worldwide was likely to collapse in the year 2100, unless global policy moved towards a zero growth model and addressed the gap between rich and poor countries. But O'Neill didn't like this idea of a no-growth future. By focusing on deep space, O'Neill redirected the global anxiety about the oil shock in the 1970s to these serene visions of space structures that would miraculously preserve the status quo and allow you to buy as many consumer goods as you wanted. In his words, if the Earth doesn't have enough surface area, we'll just build some more. So I don't think it's a coincidence that these fantasies about space colonization and frontier mining are coming from the same tech billionaires who built AI systems. It reveals to me a very troubling relationship to the Earth. And this is very much the language of settler colonialism, seeking to displace Earth's population and capture all of the territory for mining and extraction. So the last commons, outer space, is being captured by tech empires. And interestingly, outer space was always supposed to be kept as a commons. We had the 1967 Act, which said that any type of space activity had to be for the common benefit of all. But Bezos and Musk lobbied the US government to create a legislative loophole. So now any company that is extracting minerals from space gets to keep that as profit. So perhaps it's no surprise that the tech elite are invested in abandoning the planet, this desire to escape climate change on one hand and government regulation on the other. Space colonization really points to this type of ideology of the Übermensch, to exceed all boundaries, be they biological, legal, social, ethical, or ecological. But this is all happening at a time in history when we most need a terrestrial vision of interdependence. When I think about what inspires me for the next century, it's not these phallic space spectacles or AI techno-solutionism. It's relearning how we get to live on a planet within the capacities that it has. We urgently need a new material ethics. Achille Mbembe calls this a different politics of inhabiting the Earth and of repairing and sharing the planet. But to do that, we need to contend with the true planetary costs of the tech sector across the environment, labor, and space. And we need to look at these forms of extraction and enclosure that are moving deeper into our lives and relationships. So I'm going to end today where I started, out in the deserts of Nevada. On my very last trip to Silver Peak, I walked up into these hills and I found this place. It's a ghost town called Blair. In the 1900s, this was a thriving place. It was this huge gold rush town. People moved there for cheap housing and jobs. It had a fantastic pub. But soon the mining started to poison the ground and the water, and all of the precious minerals started to disappear. So by 1918, Blair was completely deserted. It was all over within 12 years. So as I was standing there, I started to realize that Silver Peak is likely to be a ghost town soon. The current draw on the lithium mine is extremely aggressive in response to the current demands, and nobody knows how long it's going to last. It could be 80 years or it could be much sooner. And at that point, the lithium will be gone. It will be extracted for batteries that end up in landfill. And Silver Peak, well, it'll return to its former life as a quiet place, perched on the edge of an ancient, giant salt lake, now completely vanished. Thanks.